Good morning, everybody. Hi. My name is Adam Gaitacho, and I'm a faculty member here in Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity and Political Science, also a fellow of 3CT. Thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning. I'm very, very pleased to introduce the first panel on the theme of libidinal investments in fascist politics. We'll go in the order. I'll introduce the speakers, and each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open to Q&A. I believe there are microphones. Yes. So please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to arrive to you. All right, so the first panelist is Jason Frank. Jason is the John L. Senior Professor of Government at Cornell University. He specializes in historical approaches to democratic theory with a focus on the modern history of popular sovereignty. He has published 5 books, and the most recent of which is The Democratic Sublime on Aesthetics and Popular Assembly, out with Oxford University Press in 2021. Next is William Mazzarella, who's the Newcomb Family Professor of Anthropology and of Social Sciences in the College at the University of Chicago. He is also an associate faculty in the Divinity School and a fellow at 3CT. He writes and teaches on the political anthropology of mass publicity, critical theory, aesthetics, and he's the author of also many books, including The Mana of Mass Society from UFC Press in 2017. Lisa Wedeen is the Mary R. Morton Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science in the college. She is also the director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory at the University of Chicago. She also is the author of several books, and the most recent of which is Authoritarian Apprehensions, Ideology, Judgment, and Mourning in Syria from UFC Press in 2019. So I'll turn it over to Jason first.
Great, thank you, Adam. So as many of you probably know, leading activists and intellectuals of the American far right have in recent years abandoned the language of conservatism for the language of counter-revolution. There is agreement for many within the MAGA movement, as the title of an essay in the Claremont Review has it, that conservatism is no longer enough. The urgent task for the political right today, Christopher Rufo writes, is to comprehend the dynamics of revolution and counter-revolution, and to create a strategy for dislodging the New Left ideology of 1968. The challenge must be met not solely in the realm of policy debates, but on the deepest political and philosophical grounds. We need a counter-revolution. What unites counter-revolutionaries is not necessarily a shared political vision or ideological program, but rather mutual opposition to egalitarian movements from below and a commitment to popular counter-mobilization aimed at restoring lost privileges, identities, hierarchies, ways of life. Old regimes, as Arno Mayer has it, are not easily destabilized and brought down, above all because the privileged orders fight back, rather than vacate the stage, negotiate their demise, or lay down to die. The counter-revolutionary imagination is active as much as it is reactive. It's frontlash as much as it is backlash, seeking to ferret out and target the evidence of world disordering revolution in every social nook and cranny, in everyday practices and social interactions. In thinking about the libidinal investments of fascist politics, as we've been invited to do on this first panel, it is worth asking whether, despite the lack of unifying vision or ideology, contemporary counter-revolutionary formations are nonetheless animated by common affective orientations entangled with desire, carnal gratifications that pattern and interweave their disparate and dispersed performances, utterances, and acts, counter-revolution's vast repertoire of transgressive cruelty, into recognizable and resonant wholes, where the mocking humiliation of disabled bodies meets your body, my choice, where mass kidnappings of people off the streets, out of courtrooms, out of homes, meets government officials posing in front of huddled masses of shirtless prisoners, where sermons against the curse of empathy meet online celebrations of demolished schools and hospitals and the bodies of dead children in Gaza. In the reactionary mind, Corey Robin identified a common commitment to the enlivening experience of sublime violence, linking counter-revolutionary political thought from the 1790s to the present. Violence, for these thinkers, Robin writes, is one of those experiences in life that makes us feel the most alive, an act that makes life lively. Beyond identifying the continuous preoccupation with enlivening violence in counter-revolutionary political thought, however, how do we understand the libidinal investments in such transgressive violence, which energizes the movement, pushing it ever further to the right? Perhaps the framing that comes first to mind, because it is the one so frequently repeated, and also one that is seemingly tethered to the logics of counter-revolution, is grievance, or on a more theoretical register, resentment, or following Nietzsche, ressentiment. Political scientists of all sorts have argued that white grievance, responding to the changing demographic and fear of replacement, is a driving force behind significant parts of the MAGA movement, and especially significant in explaining the politics of election denial. Other political scientists have shown that resentment of the cultural contempt and norm imposition of urban elites has invested rural whites in an identity politics that transcends and takes priority over any possible agreement in public policy. Now, ressentiment analysis is different, and at least as it's been taken up in my own field of political theory, it's often been used to explain how deep commitments to sovereign masculinity convert the inevitable failures to achieve those ideals into vengeful politics of blame and retribution for those who are taken to be responsible for that failure. Or on another register, how wounded attachments to injured, insulted, and threatened identity becomes a source of identity politics of subordination and purification. What unifies MAGA, as Francis Fukuyama has recently written along these lines, is, and I'm quoting Fukuyama here, a mentality drenched in what Nietzsche labeled ressentiment, that is, acute resentment of others based in wounded pride, perceived disregard, fears of inadequacy, and a desire to exact revenge on those who had earlier failed to pay adequate respect. Or consider Douglas Kellner, quote, Trump's rabid followers appear to be a variant of Nietzsche's mass men, seething with resentment, while Donald Trump himself is a cauldron of resentment, who has deeply internalized a lifetime of deep resentments, and thus is able to tap into, articulate, and mobilize the resentments of his followers. I am your justice. I am your retribution, as Trump likes to say. Examples could be easily multiplied. While grievance and resentment, along with their affective manifestations in anger, fear, and hatred, speak to powerful affective currents of contemporary counter-revolutionary politics, they also, at least in many of their versions, miss the animating affective dimensions that seem most distinctive to many of us. That is to say, a buoyant, crusading joy alongside the cruelty. Many of the most insightful commentators and observers of contemporary far-right politics, as Dagmar Herzog has written in her book, The New Fascist Body, have grappled with the fact that their success now as in the past must have something not to do just with fear or rage, but very unambiguously with the shared pleasures of aggression and cruelty. Pleasures that I think we should emphasize are also felt as an enlivening and disinhibited freedom. If resentment is usually figured as a reactive flight from the risky uncertainties and transformative transgressions of freedom, a longing for the security of an identity restored, contemporary counter-revolutionary formations delight in desublimation. The secret memo of fascism to its followers, Herzog writes, is not repression. On the contrary, it's a message of permission, of license and impunity, desublimating encouragements to break with restraint. Whether taking masks off during a pandemic or putting them on to carry out with impunity projects of mass deportation and political repression, the repertoires of contemporary counter-revolutionary politics revel time and again in the unbridling freedom from restraint, decorum, legality, formality, self-censorship, and especially as these prohibitions have protected the most vulnerable, precarious, marginalized, and disempowered. The frisson of disinhibition is tightly entangled with this thrill of domination. These are powerful affective resources of the mobilized dynamics of counter-revolutionary politics, as well as of their recognizable pattern of outflanking radicalization. Netter, no enemies to the right, as the MAGA motto has it. They encourage opening ever new horizons of disinhibited cruelty, a constant upping of the ante to demonstrate your based bona fides. The current debates over the Groyperization of MAGA is illuminated against this backdrop. The affective entanglements of disinhibiting freedom and domination are, of course, nothing new. They resonate across a long history of what Libby Anker has called ugly freedoms, practices of freedom that do not disavow violence or try to hide it away, but are inseparably and openly, indeed joyously, coupled with it, lending authoritarian political movement a buoyant and crusading and also often remarkably civic spirit, maybe even democratic spirit. In her work on cruelty as citizenship, Cristina Beltran has similarly emphasized that for political actors yearning to sustain or restore the hierarchical freedoms of an Ehrenfolk democracy, policing, punishing, targeting the vulnerable makes them feel stronger, freer, more agentic, transforming acts of often racialized violence into feats of heroism, democratic redemption, civic engagement, virtuous sovereignty. Now, what I've said so far leaves unaddressed one of the central concerns of most left investigations into libidinal investments of fascist politics, and certainly those of the Frankfurt School, which is the psychic entanglement of the masses and the leader. My co-panelists and other panelists later today may have something more to say about psychoanalytic theories of fascism and the centering of many of these theories on the dynamics of identification that Freud argued was central to the group psychology. I myself do not have a fully considered view of the relevance of the group psychology and identification for illuminating the libidinal investments of contemporary counter-revolutionary politics. And I think some critics of Freud's group psychology coming from within that general tradition, and here I would say Klaus Teweleit, who I know we're going to hear a little bit more about this afternoon, is especially important. But I would like to end my remarks by briefly touching on this question as it relates to what I've said here. One of the reasons that Freud broke with earlier crowd psychology and the imitation suggestion paradigm of thinkers like Laban and Tard is that he believed previous crowd theorists placed insufficient emphasis on the importance of the leader in the psychology of the group, and that the emphasis on what he called the magic word or the screen of suggestion obscured the grounding of the libidinal tie with the leader and with each member of the group in the desire of the subject. Freud's discussion of identification as an elementary emotional tie to separate it from object cathexis, to want to be rather than to want to have, sets the stage for conceptualizing a form of subordination that is all the more complete and vivid insofar as it is experienced as an assertion of freedom, agency, willfulness, rather than as their diminution. Freud's group psychology therefore offers insights into how the subordinated relationship between masses and leader can be experienced as a vivifying freedom, an enhancement of popular capacities rather than their stultifying limitation or heteronomic imposition. And he does so famously by arguing narcissism becomes the basis for understanding the psychic dynamics involved in group formation. Identification, as Mikkel Borch-Jakobsen perceptively writes, is situated in Freud's analysis at the intersection of two series that he has set in opposition to one another: Bindung, object cathexis, libido, love, eros, altruism, versus Loslösung, panic, narcissism, egoism, aggression. The narcissistic circuit of identification provides Freud with a conceptual basis for uniting these opposing series in a dynamically ambivalent emotional tie, and for understanding how the group's subordination to the leader can be experienced as a thrilling enlargement of the subject's own personality, rather than a delimitation of it, a liberatory violation of prohibition rather than a subjection to them. It redirects the anomic and antisocial energies of narcissism and of panic into a more potent form of libidinal subordination. The leader who Freud depicts in very Trumpian terms as aggressive, uninhibited, completely narcissistic, becomes the central focus of the group's collective narcissism. Through identification, the group members feel their personal desires and ambitions merge with the ambitions of the leader, allowing them to feel more powerful and significant. Here is the former vice president of the now disbanded New York Young Republican Club. President Trump embodies the American people, our psyche, from id to superego. His soul is totally bonded with our core value and emotions, and he is our total and indisputable champion. This tremendous connection threatens the established order. Or consider Laura Loomer in a recent profile in The New Yorker. I don't want to say, oh, President Trump is me, or I see myself in Trump, but I do. I mean, I do. Every time I listen to him speak, I feel like I'm listening to myself speak to myself. Does that make any sense? In thinking together about the libidinal investments of fascist politics, understanding how the disinhibited freedoms of cruelty and domination help propel the movement forward and ever further to the right, and how these affective economies are invested in distinctive dynamics of popular identification. I think there's many different forms of popular identification. But this investigation may offer one way to grapple with the authoritarian imaginaries and the authoritarian realities of our present. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. So the name of this presentation, as you can see, is What Economy? And I figured I might as well begin with 2 servings of fascist potatoes. The first comes from Wilhelm Reich, the great renegade psychoanalyst who observed in 1934 that Hitler's gift of a sack of potatoes to every worker was 99% ideology and only 1% practical value. The second is from just a few years later, in 1941, and appears in Peter Viereck's Metapolitics. Viereck writes that in fascism, even the price of potatoes must be heroic. Today, perhaps we should replace potatoes with eggs. Earlier this year, one sensed a sore point, perhaps even a symptom, when Donald Trump reposted Charlie Kirk yelling, "Shut up about egg prices. Trump is saving consumers millions." Right after that, egg prices spiked. But the idea that there might be something at least aspirationally heroic about egg prices, that seems to be entirely lost on all those pundits who, in the wake of Trump's return, keep admonishing us to get real, get serious, and pay attention to what really matters, otherwise known as the economy. Consider an opinion piece from January this year by James Carville, the man who once spun Bill Clinton into office. Now here Carville was once again, a fortnight before Trump's second inauguration, first conceding that he was wrong about Kamala Harris and then offering the requisite atonement, the ritual return to reality. "We lost for one very simple reason," wrote Carville. "It was, it is, and it always will be the economy, stupid. We have to begin 2025 with that truth as our political North Star and not get distracted by anything else." This is not just a centrist tic. Bernie Sanders, too, seemed to think that he'd put his finger on the main pathology of Trumpism when he pointed out just after the inauguration that Trump, in his address, had said nothing about the economy. Both Carville and Sanders, despite their many differences, used this notion of the economy as if its meaning and also its authority were self-evident. Brass tacks, bread and butter, cost of living. What could be more self-explanatory? Now, before digging into this, a couple of qualifiers. First, by putting pressure on this notion of economy, I'm not saying that the real action is necessarily somewhere else. Actually, I want to look harder at this curiously self-certain notion of economy. Second qualifier, I realize that what I'm doing might in some ways seem just the sort of thing that anthropologists have always done, namely to insist that the formalistic, free-floating, fetishized thing that modern economics calls the economy is an ideological reification. That's all well and good, that's true, but it's also not enough. Okay, so if we want to mess a bit with this complacent concept, the economy, let's begin by considering how the meaning of the ritual admonishment, "It's the economy, stupid," how this meaning would start to slide if economy also meant psychic economy or libidinal economy. Or what if, when former Biden advisor Neera Tanden says people understand this cost of living problem, she also meant to engage the psychic cost of living? I really don't think this is a fanciful or whimsical proposition. The only thing that makes it sound at all provocative is the bogus self-evidence of this idea of the economy. What actually could be more self-evident than that basic problems of flourishing, provisioning, health, education are just as much a question of our psychic affordances as they are of dollars and cents? As for my second qualification, that the economy is an ideological reification, the reason I said that's true but also not enough is because we also need to pay attention to the kinds of psychic work that a notion like the economy does. In particular, perhaps, we need to think about the anxiety-soothing work it does, the way it helps us not to have to face up to certain libidinal investments of our own. And yes, investments is an apt term here, invoking both the stock market and the quasi-theological authority assumed by the one who is invested, enrobed in the vestments. Part of the reason the opposition to Trump is flailing so badly is that they don't want to go there. They don't know how to go there. They still think that they can score points by demonstrating that Doge's rampage through the federal government earlier this year didn't actually produce the advertised savings. But wasn't the whole point of Doge the libidinal kicks invited by being allowed to watch a tech child army going in there and ripping things apart, giving all those bureaucratic stiffs in their slack-off sinecures a tight slap around the chops? The best that the Democrats could come up with in response when they weren't earnestly fact-checking the numbers was some variant on Tim Walz's weak wannabe zinger from the previous summer, "They're weird." In that tradition, after Trump's victory in November 2024, Ezra Klein complained that the challenge with making sense of Trump is that the reality he creates is so crazy that it's hard to even engage it without starting to sound unhinged. That sense of losing the normal as things get weird is precisely why so many find comfort in scurrying back to the safe zone marked the economy. A specter is haunting the economy. Or maybe it's a phantasm. Here I'd like to think along with the argument that Judith Butler developed in their keynote address at our 3CT anniversary conference last spring. Butler was talking about what they called fascist passions. They suggested that fascist passions are animated by certain phantasms that work, as they put it, as condensed sites of excitability. Examples of such spectral sites of excitability would be gender-affirming care for trans kids, immigrants eating your pets, taking your jobs, diluting the brittle grandeur of American whiteness, and just generally everything that can be imagined as perverting the grand course and cause of patriarchal American whiteness. All of them are phantasms that, to quote Butler, incite fears that convert into hatred and popular support for authoritarian leaders. I really like Butler's formulation, condensed sites of excitability, because it reminds us that the phantasms are powerful media of incitement, of provocation, of activation. Now, to get back to the question of economy, we could say that these phantoms are sites of libidinal investment that go beyond economy in the sense that they are libidinally priceless. At the same time, publicists and strategists are constantly trying to economize them, that is, to harness them to various symbolic economies, which is to say, various ideological discourses. To put it very schematically, This whole game is a dialectic of incitement and containment, or you could say a dialectic of phantasm and economy. The thing about this dialectic is that it is both necessary and impossible. It's necessary because you can't secure a political yield from your phantasm unless you find a way of yoking it to an ideological discourse that has its own economy, its own logic of equivalences. But the dialectic is also impossible because the power of the phantasms comes from inciting excitements that are irreducible to any calculation of interest, cost-benefit, good and evil, or rational choice. Irreducible to all those kinds of terms that we throw around too readily, economies, logics, grammars. Consider, for instance, the undocumented immigrant worker in northeastern Pennsylvania who tells a journalist right around the time of the 2024 election, "I love Mr. Trump. Of course he could send me back at any moment, but if he did, I would still love him." This kind of excitement is at once inside and outside economy. It's not enough only to say, as some do, that such excitements exceed economy, because the point is that their very excess is what allows them to feed and animate economies, both symbolic and financial. Or to put it differently, they are an important reason why people will, enthusiastically, passionately, vote for politics that will shred their lives. Speaking of passions, Butler, in their paper, also makes the important point that a passion is something that one undergoes. Passion, they write, implies passivity or yielding, even a captivation, or a way of being held captive, not by an external force, but by what we might call the force of fantasy. There's a great deal to say about this, but for now, let me just suggest that if economic life is generally imagined as a space of agency, then passionate, phantasmic life could be called a space of patiency. A Neoplatonist might say that what we call agency is our power to make, and that what I'm calling patiency is our power to be made, which is another way of saying our power to be activated by phantasms. Perhaps there's some mileage in thinking the unresolvable dialectic of economy and phantasm this way, as a dialectic of agency and patiency, of what we do and what we undergo. What I do know for sure about phantasms is that they're not just sites of reactionary effervescence. Any political project, or even social order that expects our commitment, needs its own phantasms, its own condensed sites of excitability. One reason that the Democratic opposition to Trump has been so ineffectual is that so many of its leaders still hew to the fond liberal fantasy that if we could just clear the air of all these feelings, if we could just get back to making good arguments, for example, if we could just focus on the economy for a moment and not get so distracted by all these cultural issues, then we could stabilize the ship of state again. The problem with this demand is that it misses its own phantasmic attachment. To be specific, it misses the intensity of its enjoyment of the phantasm of precisely the economy. One of the characteristics of liberalism, especially in its technocratic forms, is its curious belief that it is free of jouissance, it's free of enjoyment, that it's sober and measured. My friend, the philosopher Aaron Schuster, puts it well, quote, "It's not that the technicians do not play, but that they do not know that they are playing. Play, that is enjoyment, is their blind spot, even though or precisely because they claim to represent knowledge." In the current configuration of American national politics, then, we find ourselves confronted with a dismal choice. On the one side, a neo-fascist politics whose face is all shameless enjoyment. On the other, a liberalism that's unable to consider its own enjoyments because it refuses to confront the fact that it has any. One could say, perhaps, that if Trumpism is constantly inventing new ways to economize enjoyment, then its critics too often remain stuck in an unwitting enjoyment of economy, which is to say, an anxious drive attachment to this spuriously self-evident figure of the economy as a measure of common sense reality, the talisman that will stop things from getting too weird. Just a couple of things in conclusion. Freud's advice on how each of us may husband our enjoyments in civilization and its discontents is well known. He writes, "Happiness, in the reduced sense in which we recognize it as possible, is a problem of the economics of the individual's libido. There is no golden rule which applies to everyone. Every man must find out for himself in what particular fashion he can be saved. Now again, there's a lot that could be said, that has been said about this passage, the way it privatizes the problem, each the master of their own libidinal oikos, the way, despite all of Freud's misgivings about religious longing, it still invokes salvation, but again, as a private thing. But I want to underline the tone of hard-won realism that Freud adopts here, happiness in the reduced sense in which we recognize it as possible. The problem, as Freud sees it, is that balancing the libidinal books necessarily means sacrifice, compromise, resignation. Pleasure and reality are forever at odds. In that sense, there is no libidinal economy for Freud. There's just a kind of negotiated settlement. Now, I opened today with Freud's turbulent disciple, Wilhelm Reich, who broke with Freud specifically because he found Freud's resignation politically, humanly unacceptable. Reich saw quite clearly, almost a century ago now, that the organized left, in its rigid economism, suffered from a disastrous refusal to think clearly about the libidinal structures of capitalism, of the patriarchal family, and of the way that they train us for authoritarianism. Just as Marx historicized the political economists, so Reich historicized Freud's libidinal resignation as a specific and therefore not inevitable bourgeois formation. Virek's line about how fascism needs even the price of potatoes to be heroic is, I think, wiser than it knows. Because if there's a curious grandeur, a curious sense of the momentous around potato or egg prices under fascism, then that's not because fascism perversely needs to aestheticize every last banal corner of everyday life. Rather, it's because fascism responds to real needs that most of its opponents don't really know how to talk about. If the price of potatoes can take on a heroic glow, then it's because this whole notion of the economy condenses investments, libidinal investments, that go way beyond dollars and cents. Reich and others saw this clearly almost a century ago. Today, too, the right has long since stolen a march on the opposition when it comes to the libidinal. Too much ground has already been lost. MAGA-adjacent folks are calling themselves vitalists, even as right-of-center liberals like David Brooks decry the Trumpies as pagans. Once more, in the name of getting real, many Democrats seem to think that political energy is the same thing as toxic masculinity. Consider John Fetterman, or the mortifying spectacle of Gavin Newsom manning up to Joe Rogan. We really can't afford this nonsense. So, in search of counter-imaginaries, counter-phantasms, in search of what they might afford, let's consider the affordances of our shared archives. We have the experience of the ones who gave the beast a long, hard look last time, and it wasn't only about potatoes. Consider Georges Bataille, who had a thing or two to say about libido and its ambiguous relation to economy. Amid a rising fascist tide in the mid-1930s, Bataille insisted that other phantasms, other sites of excitability, were possible. He wrote, "From the outset, the mere consideration of affective social formations reveals the immense resources, the inexhaustible wealth of the forms particular to affective life. It remains possible to envision forms of attraction that differ from those already in existence. An organized understanding of the movements in society, of attraction and repulsion, starkly presents itself as a weapon at this moment when a vast convulsion opposes not so much fascism to communism, but radical imperative forms to the deep subversion that continues to pursue the emancipation of human lives." Thank you.
As some of you may know, much of my work has been on authoritarian imaginaries in Syria and Yemen. Today, I'm going to apply some of what I've learned in the Middle East analytically to the United States in an effort to deprovincialize the Middle East and provincialize the United States. Taking this approach to the Trump phenomenon requires us to theorize the ideological investments and libidinal satisfactions that bind his authoritarian-minded followers to him, especially given the license followers simultaneously grant him to act with impunity. On the one hand, Trump's adherents suffer the dissonance of having to pretend he's not continuously performing the vulgar, rude, or grotesquely immoral actions that are his stock in trade. On the other, they get to confect onto the violence and aggression guiding his arbitrary exercise of power. These are points to which we shall return. In the story I want to tell, ideological investments more generally operate through seduction, arousing fantasy content while simultaneously diffusing it and smoothing out contradictions. People's shared ideological investments help them manage collective anxieties and socio-political incompatibilities by allowing such dissonances to be contained, displaced, and disavowed. As containment, ideology operates by making what are essentially social and historical anxieties seem natural and inevitable, gratifying desires largely to the extent that they are kept in check. Containment is also at work when people cathect onto objects that cannot ultimately satisfy. It generates modes of hyper-identification in which it's possible to fantasize sharing in celebrity, glamour, or wealth, or whatever, without believing we can ever adequately imitate the exemplar. Entailed in these instances are what Frederick Jameson felicitously termed a fantasy bribe. And in the context of thriving right populism in the current US political universe, the bribe functions rhetorically by arousing white supremacist feelings of solidarity while paving over or otherwise managing white working class discontent, and what must be, at least among evangelicals, some measure of moral revulsion. Jameson and others, including Zizek and Judith Butler, have theorized containment in terms of Freud's account of condensation in his dream work analysis. As Butler tells us, ideology operates through unconscious modes of condensation, where, quote, condensation names how disparate psychic and social elements are arbitrarily connected with one another and reduced to a single reality. And again, like Freudian dream work, ideology also works through displacement. It relocates uncomfortable fears onto new objects, allaying anxieties by displacing the unbearable onto a fantasy other. In a world animated by, say, Donald Trump, this explains how he derives political advantage from direct attacks on Muslims or blacks or immigrants or LGBTQ+ people, to name some obvious examples. Gendered and racialized populations are a bit like the shark in Jameson's analysis of the movie Jaws, where he shows how the sublimely oversized animal stands in for a host of inchoate fears. In our own times, this displacement and condensation onto the other, onto the monstrous figure of the immigrant or the trans person or the Muslim or the SNAP recipient as revitalized welfare queen, can rightly be regarded as resulting from neoliberal policies and white working class discontent, and the effects, of course, of deindustrialization. But the political economy conditions of white working class disaffection explains neither Trump's supporters' openness to violence nor their appetite for the continuous spectacle of gratuitous cruelty. Ideology also operates as disavowal, and some of you may know that I have drawn extensively on the theorist Octave Manoni and how people rationalize their lives by acknowledging and disavowing simultaneously. The phrase I know very well and yet nevertheless are all the same, je sais bien mais quand même, exemplifies this mode of ideological coping, a distancing from accountability that has implications for politics. In the case of Trump supporters in the United States, disavowal typically works like this. I know very well that he shouldn't be saying racist things, but he is funny. Or I know very well that he lies, but politicians never tell the truth. Or I know very well that he said those lewd things about women, but it's just locker room talk, and boys will be boys. Disavowal goes beyond denial in that it poses the problem it works to dismiss. So realities that cannot be denied can still be ignored. Disavowal expresses the contradiction it simultaneously repudiates, and it suggests a degree of pleasure to be derived from the secret implicit logic of the self-sanctioned transgression, something I think that Jason was getting at earlier. To recap thus far, in the course of cultivating citizens' attachments, ideology complicates matters of belief and unbelief so that people can know things and not know them at the same time. Ideology might generate ardent loyalty in some cases, but at least as effectively in political terms, it cultivates ambivalence among less ardent supporters. For some Trump followers, this means toggling between desires for an unruly undoing of politics as usual and their compensatory attachment to a mythic order of former and soon-to-be future greatness. Ambivalence plays an enabling role for supporters who enjoy watching him destroy valuable public institutions and upend innocent people's lives, undermining working-class economic interests, even while satisfying something powerful in white masculinist constituencies, whether working class or not. Trump arouses and manages his followers' desire for revenge in a process psychoanalysts might describe as adjacent to jouissance. The vengeful rage he taps into, in other words, appears as a source of enjoyment inextricably linked to the death drive, motivating a politics that can reasonably be termed fascist. The Trump phenomenon is classically fascist because it depends on followers' identification with a strong, charismatic leader endowed with quasi-supernatural powers, like surviving an assassination. The leader stands at the head of a system devoted to rigidly hierarchical forms of sociality. Fascism maintains, as does MAGA, an essentialist ontology of peoplehood, conjuring a mythic past of lost glory projected onto an aspirational future that cannot and need not be delivered. It celebrates a form of hypermasculinity whose power is tethered not only to fantasies of domesticity, but to the homosociality rooted in the pleasures to be taken from the violent othering of the vulnerable. It creates the permissive conditions for an organized chaos guided by aggression. And unlike some views of fascism in which adherents are necessarily true believers, my understanding of fascist ideology accommodates a range of intensities and orientations towards belief, attachment, and desire. Fascism may aspire to the total surrender of adherents, but it can live and even flourish without it. When social scientists wonder what's wrong with working-class Americans that makes them willing to vote against their material interests to vote Republican, they're assuming that our interests as individuals are coherently related to one another, when in truth they often are not. They also assume that affective investments in cognitive interests can be neatly disentangled. We want the state and we don't want it at the same time, or we want aspects of the state but not others. We can take pleasure in sentimental fictions while also being repulsed by their power to manipulate. We can worry about wasting water and also want green parks. Trump's brazenness can be a source of fascination, even prompt a certain repugnant admiration, as well as being a trigger for despair, comedy, and/or political action, and even all three simultaneously. With 42 million Americans on the eve of being denied their much-needed food benefits, Trump's Great Gatsby party was a masterclass in MAGA's ostentatious disregard for the suffering of ordinary people. To be clear, the steady barrage of cruelty may ultimately backfire by congealing ordinary incoherencies into a more pronounced set of untenable contradictions. After all, as comedians have been pointing out, things didn't end well for Jay Gatsby either. But so far, at least, Trump's performative refusal to demonstrate care and his willingness to bully have been part of the fascist appeal. Precisely his refusal to pretend to the usual pious bromides of politics, which is mistaken at times for honesty, is key to his magnetism. Holding the Gatsby party the night before SNAP benefits were set to lapse brings ideology's workings into bold relief. The party arouses the dream image of American opulence while limiting it to those who not only can afford its indulgence, but are willing to relate sycophantically in public to a president whose narcissism demands absolute fealty. For those of us in the opposition, the party might displace anxieties temporarily onto the spectacle of a woman in a martini glass, where being revulsed by our own captivation is part of the scene's luridness. Supporters who are not blind to the contradictions are kept in play in a state of disavowal, where they sense very well the underlying obscenity while recognizing, even celebrating, the billionaire's right to their singular enjoyment. Or perhaps the idea is that everyone would do the same thing if they could, or that in the end, the people on SNAP are gaming the system too. Or perhaps it's one answer on one occasion and another the next time the contradictions become so curiously, enjoyably blatant. To conclude, Trump's emancipation from presidential gravitas, the rule of law, diplomatic decorum, the obligation to respect facts, literacy, or the norms of basic human compassion is titillating to his supporters. To be sure, Trump's populism feeds on the fact that a great many average citizens are feeling profoundly disaffected from the polity. Yet crucially, as Lauren Berlant and Aaron Schuster, who William also invoked, have argued, the pent-up outrage motors an intense identification with Trump's emotional freedom. He's free to say and do whatever he wants, to voice racist thoughts, to bully those he identifies as weaklings, to flaunt his pornographic desires in public, to make fun of disabled people, to flagrantly abuse public coffers for private gain, to grift, and all but incessantly to lie. His MAGA constituents' identification enables their own pleasure in his freedom to disregard elementary human decencies, or as Jon Stewart put it, to not give a fuck about not giving a fuck. I want to close by deepening our exploration of the dynamics of ideological identification with a brief discussion of a 2-minute AI video that Trump posted himself in the late spring, early summer of this year. And then I want to say something about it after we watch it. And all trigger warnings in effect here. Have you?
Just a small town girl, living in a lonely world. She took the midnight train going anywhere. Just a city boy, born and raised right here in Houston. He took the midnight train going anywhere.
On the surface, the video is an odd-seeming parody, given its posting on Truth Social, of Trump's delusions of grandeur. But I want to propose a more complicated story of ideological disavowal with revenge at the center. The video in no way pretends Trump himself is really playing the piano, guitar, or drums. On the contrary, a close-up of the AI-generated fingers on the keys emphasizes the disingenuousness of the piece. This isn't even a deep fake, but a superficial one. All the more effectively, then, it operates within the logic of its presumed addressees, who know what it is to be ignored or rejected, but who see here that they can not only fantasize a world with the adoring crowds and the multi-talented performance, but also inhabit it. For the brief period of the video, everything is within reach. What Trump as the everyman of compensatory vengeance can't actually do, he makes up for by acting as if he can. This is not so much another instance of Trumpian public dissimulation, but a reject's guide to indulging fantasies of abundant talent and cheering crowds. It's the grotesque boy getting all the pretty girls. It doesn't matter that it isn't true. It doesn't matter that it's not believed. It doesn't even matter that it's couched in irreverence. Trump offers to all comers the chance to have the last laugh along with him. And whatever anyone else might have to say about its whatever anyone else might have to say is in fact immaterial. His emotional freedom is an identification magnet for anyone who has ever been rejected or underestimated or criticized by woke know-it-alls. I know very well that this isn't true, but nevertheless, it speaks to me, and in some ways, to everyone. We are all addressees. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for fantastic papers. So I think we'll just open it up for questions. So if you could just raise your hand and I'll try to call on you. And please do wait for the microphone to come around so we can hear you and it's on the recording. Jennifer. Anna.
This is a question provoked by the video that Lisa showed and what Lisa was saying, but it's for anyone, which is the combination of cruelty and silliness in Trumpian fascism seems very different from earlier forms of fascism, and I wonder, I mean, the kind of memification, or, you know, is it a joke or is it not, alongside undeniably, you know, extraordinary cruelty. I just wonder if you might reflect on that.
We can take one, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I welcome other people's responses too. I think that's a very good point. Of course, jokes are often forms of aggression in their own right, and Alenka Zupancic has this wonderful account of the power of comedy to allow you to fulfill a satisfaction you didn't even, or a demand you didn't even know you had. And I think Trump, as an entertainer, whose, you know, Apprentice series in the 90s was so important to reality television, is very well aware, or at least his handlers are well aware of the ability to play on this silliness in a way that one could argue sometimes displaces the cruelty, sometimes works in tandem with the cruelty, sometimes is meant to, or sometimes, I don't want to think too intentionally here, but sometimes the logic is such that addressees can be addressed quite differently, or different addressees can be addressed differently. And I do think that that combination of cruelty and silliness brings in folks who otherwise might not be as captivated, even if they want to disavow what's happening to them, even if they reject a certain modality of
of displacement, even if they certainly don't want the kind of reavowal in fascist politics that some of his ardent followers embrace. So I think it's a very important way in which both the affinities between cruelty and silliness and those things that allow for the juxtaposition can work in tandem to help to explain some of the libidinal investment and ideological charge behind Trumpism.
Can I say one thing to that too, Jennifer? I mean, I think the people that have written about this question was raised for me also by reading your paper, Lisa, about a certain kind of wrestling dynamic in, like, the idea that there's a suspension of belief about whether what's going on in the ring is real or not. But that's actually a part of its power, because it invites you to participate in the production of the spectacle. Like, the addressees actually have a kind of agency in sustaining that kind of undecidability about whether the roles are genuinely being played or whether they're in fact acted. So with the example that you brought up around cruelty, I mean, it's actually some of his most, I think of that post that he had the morning or a couple of days before federal troops or National Guard troops were deployed to Chicago, where he's dressed up as the character from Apocalypse Now, and he says, and it posts like, "I love the smell of deportations in the morning." Like,
Yeah.
that's a perfect encapsulation of that, and it does, of course, function. Like, you're in on the joke, and those who would be outraged by it, they're too serious. It's a way of kind of conveying a cruelty, getting it across, maybe pushing the window of what can be said, but also being able to it allows for a kind of plausible deniability that it's genuinely meant. But I do think the people that have written about wrestling in the Trump phenomenon, it's actually really insightful work. The term that they use is kayfabe, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, just very briefly, I was going to say more or less the same thing that Lisa and Jason said. I mean, I think with the question of enjoyment, with the question of jouissance, there's always that kind of ambiguous area where it's like the tickle, right? Like, there's kind of, when you're tickled, there's like both agony and helpless giggling at the same time. And that combination of kind of violence and play, the uncertainty of that relationship, I think is kind of part of what's at work there. So.
In the back, or we can take Anton. Sorry.
Thanks. I think this will maybe sound a little flat-footed, but I mean, I do wonder what role there is in understanding what's going on now in people's attractions to Trump. What role there is played by, the price of eggs and the lapse of SNAP benefits in healthcare and things like that. I mean, it's true that the Democratic Party has been nothing in response to Trump, but it seems surprising to, look to the. You could wonder, well, what does that have to do? I mean, what does the Democratic Party's abandonment of ordinary people have to do with the attractions to Trump? I mean, that's got. I mean, libidinal investment may have something to do with it, but I mean, there are other things as well that one might wonder about. And I mean, if there's been any glimmer of hope in recent years, it's been the campaign of Zoran Mamdani, where affordability was the line. So what role does that have to do, or what role is that playing in what's going on?
I feel like this one is most directly addressed to me. The price of
Indeed,
eggs.
go for it.
Thanks, Anton. So I just wanted to underline that my point was not at all to suggest that economic factors in the usual understanding of the term are not important, right? Like, I think that is in a way taken for granted, right? This is important. The price of eggs is important. The price of potatoes is important, etc. What I was trying to point to is, I guess, a couple of things. One is that the very notion of the economy, the way it gets used in debates affects a kind of bogus disarticulation, shall we say, from other aspects of life, which are as important and which in some ways I think, we shouldn't be making the move of saying like economy is over here and then there's like these libidinal things over here, right? The whole point is that if we're talking about economy, we should be talking about it as a kind of, let's say, holistic phenomenon, right? Like as something that actually includes psychic affordances, libidinal affordances, etc., and that everything that we understand along the lines of those things that sort of economic analysis usually addresses, affordability, flourishing, well-being, health, all of those things are not disarticulable or separable from the psychic investments and the psychic economies that sort of make life livable and that make us able to imagine other forms of life as well. So again, I just want to underline this because I knew when I was writing the paper that there was a danger that people were going to hear me as saying, I don't think the economic stuff is important, and that's not what I'm saying. In a way, I'm putting pressure on the notion of economy to see what else it might mean, apart from just the price of eggs.
Do you want to? Okay.
I can say
Okay.
something after.
So there's one question there. Right. Yeah, there we go.
Thanks. Thanks for a wonderful panel. And I really appreciate the focus on the libidinal, which I think is crucial for thinking about these issues. At the same time, this is maybe a bit of a follow-up on Anton's question. I think it's interesting to put Judith Butler's introduction in conversation with this panel. It seemed like maybe there might be more to say about a possible tension, not between their introduction and the panel, but within the panel around the question of whether the kinds of counter arguments or counter imaginaries, maybe it matters also which term one chooses, would be made in the name of producing better fantasies or better kinds of libidinal solicitation or ones that would address our ends, versus, to me, Lisa, you're using a term like disavowal suggests that there is actually something that is being ignored that is true. Even in like the structure of the fetish, I think, has that built into it. So I guess I'm curious whether there is any tension around that question, whether we do simply want to say we need to counter these fantasies with other fantasies. And if so, I guess I really would be curious to hear more about what that would look like on the left if we take seriously the claims that all of you have made about the need for a kind of libidinal address specifically. I'm not sure just a return to elementary human decencies, as you put it, Lisa, is going to take exactly that form.
Can we take a couple more questions? So Judith Butler has a question in the front, and then on the on the windowsill too. Sorry.
Well, here are a couple of maybe comments.
Okay.
I'm wondering what difference it makes to the argument about economy if we recognize the work that's been done to separate economy from finance, and then think about speculation as an activity that is also obviously implicated in libidinal and phantasmatic domains within new financial organizations. And that seems important, as I understand it, for understanding privatization and neoliberalism both. But also, I think it's important to note that Freud's work on mass psychology is actually published during the same time that he's developing the idea of the death drive. Yeah. And what significance does sadism and destructiveness have to the death drive as a counter within the psyche to jouissance and pleasure? And in Civilization and Its Discontents, he says, look, it can work both ways. Pleasure can be in the service of the death drive, or the death drive can be in the service of pleasure, which is happening here. So I thought maybe the death drive has a has a place in some of this. Maybe also the last thing well, there are two things. One is, Lisa, is there a difference between disavowal and what Freud talks about as splitting, Spaltung, which is one of his last essays, actually. And in that case, we don't have the fetishistic structure. There's no I who could say, I know very well, but still, because the I who says, I know very well, is at a distance from the I who says, I also hold, not even I also hold, but I hold to this view. And those two views cannot touch each other, so they couldn't even be brought into the grammar of I know very well, but still, because that I is a unified I, but the splitting of the ego does something different, where you can hold two contrary sets of beliefs without letting them touch one another. And I think sometimes when we see the desublimation and excitement, the freedom in the identification with Trump, who can lie and get away with it, what kind of man is that? There are no limits. For people who feel a lot of limits in their lives. And then the sadism against those who are most in need, the most vulnerable, the poor, the hungry. Like so that the subscription to a repressive and depriving regime, right? Like, how are those two things held together, or are they held together at all? So, yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more question on the windows.
Thank you so much for these topics. I'm going to sound like a little bit of like a pervert, and I am hidden in a corner behind a curtain, so that doesn't help. But I'm wondering, somebody said earlier about the opposing libidinal imaginaries, and I was compelled to think about it. I wasn't there in the 60s, but there is like a certain kind of image of the hippie or the left as like sexual, as fun, as free, as physically in the world in an enjoyable way that is, I think, potentially powerful enough to counter the authoritarian imaginaries, which to me seem starkly unphysical and unmoored in the physical joys of the human body in a way that I think the left might be able to reclaim that kind of freewheeling, fully embodied love type of thing. Because when you think of the authoritarian people like the Elon Musks who procreate without sex and who seem somewhat disgusted by the pleasures of human touch or whatever, I think maybe the left might be able to reclaim like the hippie aesthetic or something, if that's possible. And just to be like more sexy.
Sorry, there was one other question on the windowsill, and then we'll take this last question, and then the panelists will respond to what they can, and then we'll close out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So for Lisa, with the deep identification, and I love those quotes you used from Laura Loomer, and I forgot who it was.
No,
right?
that was Jason who.
Oh, was that Jason's?
Yeah.
My bad. Okay, I'm jumbling these quotes. So for perhaps this question is for both or either of you. The deep identification of Trump supporters and followers with their leader. Do you think there might be a fracturing or a crack in the mirror with respect to the Epstein files?
Yes.
Talk about a libidinal investment. I mean, and of course there's a fallacy in progressive. There's a wish element, right? There's a wish fulfillment in, this is the one that's going to bring Trump down. This is the moment where it's all going to come unraveled, and it never happens. And yet, so I'm not saying that it's coming unraveled, but there's clearly something going on. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene has now officially broken with Trump. He has denounced her and says he's going to try to oppose her in Georgia. And there seems to be something deeper going on in the MAGA base. It's like a Frankensteinian dynamic where I just wonder on a psychic level if you see something significant going on, however it plays out, like what's happening with the identification and disidentification and sort of cognitive dissonance or emotional agony that seems to be going on with that. And then quickly to William, I loved your observation about the resonance, despite superficial differences, between James Carville and Bernie Sanders on the question of the economy. I think there's something deeper to explore there, and I guess what I would want to ask you is, your critique is principally, it seems at least in this talk, your target is principally liberal centrism and economists and sort of mainstream discourse around the economy. But I think there were little hints of critique also at the kind of class-first socialist left and the sort of, there's a kind of neo-retro Marxism in the pages of Jacobin and its theoretical journal Catalyst, which is trying to push a class-first politics against what it perceives as a sort of overly identitarian drift of the left. And I wonder if your argument is actually also a critique of that style of a kind of neo-economistic socialist politics.
So I'll leave it to the panelists to pick up on whatever they would like.
Shall I just quickly? Okay. Obviously, this is way more than I can address in a couple of minutes, but maybe just touch on a few things, beginning with Judith Butler's invitation to think a little bit more about this question of economy, finance, speculation. The word speculator historically means someone with occult capacities for seeing, a kind of mantic capacity. And I wonder whether we might not retrieve some of that kind of speculative potentiality in such a way that speculation could mean something other than a further abstraction of capitalism and a kind of regrounding of the question of a more adventurous economic life in the forms of everyday existence. So I know that's a bit cryptic, but I'll just leave that point there. The other one, both for Judith Butler's question and for the pervert behind the curtain, and for Danny over there, hi Danny, I just wanted to say that obviously, I've been reading Wilhelm Reich recently, and I've always been interested in Reich, and Danny knows this, but I've kind of been in a bit of a deep dive recently. And one of Reich's investments is in a critique of Freud's theory of the death drive, right? Reich absolutely rejects the notion of the death drive as a kind of fundamental drive. He actually sees it as a secondary distortion of a kind of primary expression of life and of energetic pulsation, basically, as a sort of common cosmic principle. I'm not sure he always reads Freud's notably enigmatic discussion of death drive and beyond the pleasure principle correctly. And I would also want to pay attention to the way in which someone like Marcuse took up the notion of death drive as actually a kind of revolutionary affirmative principle rather than just a kind of locus of sadism and violence and self-destruction. But I think what is interesting is precisely the ambivalence of the figure of death drive. In that regard. In other words, if we take Freud's phrase from Beyond the Pleasure Principle seriously, that is, every being wants to die in its own way, then I think that there is a kind of optimistic affirmative implication in that, which is a kind of undoing of the particular wounds that one has sustained on the way to becoming the particular subject that one is. And so if that could be reimagined as a kind of question of a collective project, of a kind of relational project, and maybe even a kind of speculative project, then that would be, I think, exciting. Just finally, again, for the pervert over there, I can't see you very well. With Reich, one of the things that happened was, he died in 1957 in a US jail, and then his ideas were kind of subsequently taken up by the 60s counterculture in ways that I think would have actually kind of horrified him. He was not, in fact, in favor of what became known as like free love, of kind of indiscriminate sexual freedom in that sense, What he was interested in is what he called sex economy, actually, which he coupled with a notion of work democracy, which he understood to be a kind of, in a way, an articulation of some of the problems that Marx in the 1844 manuscripts had raised around alienated labor, about the possibility of human creativity, et cetera, but now brought into consideration of the libidinal dimensions of the damage that has been done to us through being raised in patriarchal nuclear families and so forth. So I'll just leave it there, but thank you for those questions.
I'll just say something very briefly about the first question and about possible differences among the panelists on the question asked. One of the reasons that I emphasized not just the sense of disinhibited transgressive freedom, but also the civic or even potentially democratic dimensions of those freedoms, is because I've always been taken by theorists on the left. I mean, Ernst Bloch would be one. I think Jameson is another, and maybe Bataille is another. Actually, this is maybe a point of connection. That make arguments that even in the most reactionary political formation or libidinal political organization, there are traces of emancipatory longing or utopia in Jameson's sense. And I think that's very close to what Bataille means by the kind of the heterogeneous in the Psychology of Fascism essay. So that is something that there may be continuity between the papers on that front, although that's not a point that I ended up pursuing in my spoken remarks, but that's a view that I definitely take, and I think it does pose one way of responding to authoritarian counter-revolutionary formations, to say that there are actual, not only there are real grievances, which is but that there are also perhaps democratic, even radical democratic longings that are internal even to the most reactionary political formations. So say that.
Thanks very much. I realize I'm the caboose here. I'll try to be quite quick as well. Somebody mentioned, I think it was Anton actually, Zoran Mamdani, and his excellent communication skills around affordability and the importance of the economy to his campaign, his successful campaign. And it seems to me that one could ask the counterfactual, would he have been so successful had he not also combined that message with a masterful command of social media, in which he also was remarkably entertaining, playful, able to harness some of the emancipatory possibilities in libidinal investment to a more affirmative political project. So I think that the economy was extraordinarily important to him. I think Gaza was important to him too, there's no question. But in addition, his ability to communicate those principles via Mr. Cardamom, for example, were important to his success. To Judith's question about disavowal versus splitting, and this gets to Danny's question also about Epstein, I think, because I have been in the brief paper more interested in the fetishistic structure. You're absolutely right, Judith. But I do think that there's another thing going on that I didn't have time to talk about, which is this splitting structure, which is, as you point out, different. It lacks the fetishistic structure. And I see that most prominently in my tour of Facebook pages on the right in MAGA communities. I see that most in the MAGA communities' unwillingness to grapple with Epstein, or in certain evangelical strains, not willing to grapple with it. Now, as you point out, there are the Marjorie Taylor Greens, there are other people. This may produce a real fissure in the movement. But what's striking to me is in many sites I'm looking at, it isn't the structure I know very well, and yet nevertheless, there's no acknowledgement. It's just the ignoring. It's a bracketing off, a splitting of the affirmation of Trump and what he's doing for people and getting rid of those immigrants on the one hand, good, and a complete
refusal to even recognize the Epstein, although, of course, they're reading the newspapers, they understand what's going on. But that, to me, seems like a kind of cognitive dissonance that's very different than the structure of disavowal. And my sense of the death drive also, or jouissance, is that it can be in the service of the death drive, and the death drive can be in the service of jouissance. And as William pointed out, that can also, it's not all bad, right? There's also a kind of emancipatory, but I don't see, I know in your recent book, Judith, you had the death drive as kind of separate from jouissance, and in my readings, they're much more inextricably linked, and we should talk more about that. And finally, about 1960s hippies. The one thing I would say, in addition to everything that's been said so far, is that hippies didn't tend to have leaders. One of the big differences between the kind of libidinal investments that hippies enjoyed was precisely to imagine a kind of democratic imaginary that didn't privilege one person. And I do wonder whether we can think through the affirmative or salutary aspects of that part of the politics for our contemporary. Do we need leaders in order to be able to properly imagine a counter-authoritarian future?
Okay, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this panel. Thank you to the three panelists.